Hi everyone, we've got a diary entry today that is not particularly consequential but interesting, at least to me. It is the 20th of February 1906, and I will dive right into it and deal with introductions on the other side. We have one new person today. All right. 20th February 1906. We had lunch at Uncle Nicky's and Aunt Alex's, and Nerod and the Naval Minister were there. The latter, at the request of the sovereign, told some anecdotes which were very stupid and nonsensical, though Uncle Nicky laughed a great deal. I like Nerod, a Horse Guards officer, terribly. He has, by the way, splendid eyes. They are radiant. So strange, really. He and I talked about skiing, and he told me about the concours hippique that had recently taken place in St. Petersburg, which was very interesting. After lunch, we had 2 lessons, French and music, and I played quite badly. Then I did my homework and played with Borya, and GM came while I was playing and told me to come read Torrents of Spring because Maria was apparently insisting on it. But I didn't go because we'll be reading for an hour after dinner, and I don't get to play soldiers with Borya very often. The 4 of us had dinner together, GM, MN, Maria, and I, and we asked GM questions about anatomy, some of which he couldn't even answer. Then we read Turgenev. How well Torrents of Spring is written. It was so interesting that we didn't notice the time flying by, though we read for an hour. I'm going to bed now. It's late. Tomorrow will be a hard day. 9:55. All right. So, doesn't seem to me, glancing at the next diary entry, that it was a particularly hard day. But that's all right. So the Naval Minister is the new person, and he was an admiral by the name of Alexei Alexeyevich Birilev. I'm not sure where the stress is. Okay, he was 60 years old, roundabout, and he had been appointed Russia's first naval minister, actually, and he had been made the commander of the Pacific Fleet before he was appointed naval minister, but after the disastrous Battle of Tsushima, where pretty much the whole Pacific Fleet, Russian Pacific Fleet, was destroyed. So he came after, so he wasn't in any way to blame for that. And clearly Dmitri didn't like him. He thought his anecdotes were stupid and nonsensical, though hopefully he didn't make that clear while he was at dinner. But Uncle Nicky thought they were very funny. Okay, so yeah, this was a difficult time in Russia for all things naval. They had to have a real reckoning. And I don't know if any of you have read my translation, the first English translation of the memoirs of a man named Fabritsky, Semyon Semyonovich Fabritsky, who was a high-ranking, he was a naval officer, and he was an admiral by the time World War I came around. He had been with the Pacific Fleet, but his tour was up, and he'd been sent home to join the Baltic Fleet before the Russo-Japanese War started. And he was an officer on the Royal Yachts for a while on the Polar Star, I think mainly on the Polar Star. And he was also a Fliegel adjutant to Nicholas II, and the two of them kind of hit it off and kind of had a friendship insofar as that was possible. And he was a very keen observer, and he talks at length about the problems in the Russian Navy prior to the Russo-Japanese War. Certainly, he almost left the Navy because he was so disgusted by the level of corruption and incompetence that he found. And he said, in fact, when he was returning from the Far East, he said that all along the way at every port, the commander of the vessel he was on would sell bits and pieces of equipment from the ship and just pocket the money. And so he was really disgusted by that, but he did stay on. So that's a book I recommend if you're at all interested, either in what it was like to be a Fliegel adjutant to Nicholas II and his personal observations, or if you're interested in the Russian Navy. So anyway, I suppose it's also worth pointing out that at that time, Alexei Alexandrovich, Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich, so Nicholas II's uncle and Dmitri's uncle, he had been the General Admiral or Admiral General of the Russian Navy at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. And he was more or less a dilettante, and so of course when an actual war broke out, he was not the best man to have at the helm. And he really blew it, and after Tsushima, his palace in St. Petersburg was vandalized, and he pretty much had to flee the country and go into sort of self-imposed exile in the south of France. But anyway, that's that. And you remember Nerod, hopefully, from a past diary entry, so I won't reintroduce him. But the interesting thing about him is the observation that Dmitri made the first time he met the man about his radiant eyes, his shining eyes, and Dmitri was really fascinated by that, and so he brings that back up. The thing he likes about Nerod, it seems, is these eyes of his. So I wish I had a picture of the man. I'll have to look for one, although maybe it wouldn't come through in a photograph. But he also likes Nerod in general, and he likes that Nerod is talking to him about a subject that he's quite keen on, which is sports. They're talking about skiing, they're talking about the concours épique that Dmitri himself would be participating in when he was a student at the Nicholas Cavalry School. And so, you know, I think back to the whole incident with the squirt gun, when Dmitri was so bored with what George Laming was talking about over dinner about aeronautics and the North Pole that he actually shot him with the squirt gun. And I think if George Mikhailovich had talked about sports or had talked about politics, then Dmitri would have been fully on board. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So he and Maria, he says, we had 2 lessons. They were studying, it's interesting to think about linguistically what they were being taught. So he doesn't talk about having English classes. I think he and Maria were basically fluent in English. And he does mention having a Russian lesson once in a while, you know, just like kids in the U.S. have English lessons to learn grammar and that sort of thing. But the 2 foreign languages, I guess, that he was learning were French and German. So you'll see references also to German lessons and to Maria staying home on one occasion because she needed to have a German lesson. So did he speak German? That was actually a question that I asked his son, because he spent the last 2 years of his life in Switzerland. But the sanatorium was very international. In fact, he noted that his nurse, the first day he arrived at the sanatorium, he was surprised to find that his nurse spoke English. So I asked his son, I asked Paul Ilinsky, did your father speak German? And he said, well, I don't know if he was fluent, but he could certainly understand, get the general idea of what people were saying, and that he could certainly make himself understood. And he certainly could in French as well. I know he was reading French novels as an adult, and he lived in France for quite a while after the Revolution, but he doesn't write in either French or German in his diaries. He writes primarily in Russian, which a lot of times surprises people. They expect that he wrote in French or English, and he did write a fair amount in English, but probably about 90% in Russian. And these diaries from when he was 14 are in Russian. And every once in a while he would have a French phrase. And German almost never. I'm not sure if I ever remember there having been a French or a German phrase. But Paulie did tell me, when the subject came up of languages, that Dmitri did speak Italian. And I think that was something that he learned electively. It wasn't offered him as classes as part of his main education. I think that was just something he wanted to do on his own. Okay, very typical of him, both with sports and with his lessons, that he is quite willing to admit when he doesn't do well. So music is another interesting topic, because he was quite a passionate guitarist in later life, and he doesn't say what he was playing, what musical instrument he was playing in this instance that he played quite badly, but I would guess it was the piano, because I think Maria in her memoirs talked about both of them playing piano and about Dmitri having a little bit of a hard time. But he was the one who really became quite a serious musician, and he would take his guitar with him when he went to parties, just in case people would ask him to play guitar. And he also, at least on one occasion in the diaries, took his guitar to a hospital when he was visiting a sick friend, so he could play for her. All right, so then after homework, which he never seems to object to doing, after homework he wants to play soldiers with Borya. He's over his embarrassment, I guess, of playing soldiers with Borya, and he is saying that he doesn't get to very often. And I suppose, he had a lot of activities and a lot of schoolwork, so that makes sense. And his sister wants him to come and read the book instead of waiting for their normal time when they read after dinner. She wants him to come and read the book now. I guess she was really into the book. And he didn't want to do that. And nobody insisted. So he got to stay and play soldiers with Borya. And we'll be coming up on at least one mention on the kind of military education he was getting, and also the kind of education he was getting as a future cavalryman in riding horses, that is, not writing. So the torrents of spring. So it's pretty clear that what they were doing in that household was, yes, reading every evening, but having books read to them. And the Torrents of Spring, the novel, or rather the novella by Turgenev, we talked about before. And I'm a bit surprised that Dmitri liked it so much, because it was more or less a romance. It was not just a love triangle, but I think a love quadrangle. I think there were 4 people involved. The protagonist was named Dmitri, and one of the women, I think, was called Maria. But and I think I mentioned before that I'm not wild about Turgenev's writing, But apparently Dmitri and Maria liked it very much, and they didn't mind being read to. I wish my nieces and nephews, when they were 14 and 16, the older ones, would have let me or somebody read to them out loud in the evening. But that, in the age of video games and YouTube, that is no more, I'm afraid, unless the parent is tying the kids to the chair. So Dmitri's father also did this. Dmitri's father, when Dmitri would come and visit him in France, or once on a holiday in Germany, he would read out loud. And Dmitri was not happy. He seems to have enjoyed this with the lemmings, but his father apparently chose what you would call maybe inspirational literature of a rather insipid kind. So I wouldn't have liked that either. And in fact, in one of his letters to his sister, he mentions that that George Mikhailovich kind of just was sitting there and picking his nose. So gross. But anyway, I'm going back to my rambling ways. I need to work on that, and we will find out tomorrow or in the next video about this hard day that Dmitri is anticipating. And I'll say in advance that it's an interesting day, and that it introduces some of the Mikhailovich Grand Dukes, and also the patriarch of that family, Grand Duke Mikhail Nikolaevich. So far we've met Sandro, who was one of those brothers. It was a big family with multiple brothers and only one girl, and they were brought up in the Caucasus. And so we will be meeting another one of them tomorrow. And yeah, so do come back for that. All right, bye.